Hello and welcome to SHOWstudio's fully digital live panel discussions. This season, experts from all parts of the industry will discuss and have been discussing and debating the most important subjects affecting the fashion industry. As you can imagine, there are many of them. Today, we are in the midst of Paris Digital Men's Fashion Week, which I think is its official title at the moment. And we're going to be discussing Yohji Yamamoto's Spring-Summer 2021 collection, which was released yesterday via a short art video, as it's been called, directed by the Japanese photographer Takai. My name is Dal Chodha, and I'm a fashion writer based in London. And I'm going to let our fabulous two panelists introduce themselves to you, starting with Rachel.
Hi, my name is Rachel, and I'm based in New York, in the United States, and I'm a style writer at GQ magazine.
Over to you, Syed.
Hi, my name is Syed Abbas. I'm a menswear blogger out of South London, and I run a blog called Dapper Kid.
Welcome to you both. We are in these kind of mock set show studio, this fabulous kind of gold leaf studio. None of us live in houses like this, but we may do afterwards. I'm tempted to redecorate, that's for sure. I'm glad we're all wearing black, because this is one of the things that people always kind of bring up when they talk about the work of the incredible Yohji Yamamoto. Just as a bit of a bio, I'm sure all of you know, and it seems kind of almost a bit ridiculous to kind of mention these things, but I think in some ways it's always really important to lay the scene and to decorate and to give a bit of a sense of who we are talking about. And particularly for someone like Yohji, who came out of a very particular period in Japan's history, it's something he's often remarked upon, being part of this post-war generation, and it's really impacted his attitude towards clothing. He's relatively anti, I believe, fashion, if it's fair to say. The word fashion, maybe not some of the things that fashion represents, but that in itself is something I think that we can all discuss. He was born in Tokyo, but actually graduated with a law degree in the 60s, which he then gave up a law career to help his mother, who ran a dressmaking business. So occasionally in interviews, Yohji has also referred to himself as a dressmaker rather than a designer or fashion designer. He went on to study fashion at Bunka and debuted his collection in 1981 in Paris. This sense of being in this lost post-war generation I found quite interesting, because what he said is that he feels like he's part of a generation that was educated to look more to America or Europe rather than to look at Japan, which is something he did himself. You know, this idea of this thing that we have still in some ways that you have to show in Europe to be taken seriously, to make it. Of course, in a long time ago, that was even more pertinent. He was very interested, I think, in this idea that when he came and showed his collection in Paris, people saw it as being very, very Japanese, and it was described as such. And you can go back and read some reviews from the 80s in the New York Times archives, for example, which talk very much about it looking Japanese and being Japanese. And that's always really fascinating, I think, for all of us to also think about how the words and the language we use to describe clothes can sometimes brand people, and it sticks in our mind. And we think of certain things that Yohji has shown us over the years as Japanese things, which may or may not be true, but they definitely throw up some interesting ideas about what a look is and what it means. He sees himself emerging from punk, and I wondered what you both thought about that. Syed?
I think growing up post-war, that is where he says it himself, you know, that rebellion, that fighting against the system, always wanting to fight, and that does also come from like a punk sensibility. Of course, he's a lot older, I think. I'd assume, I'm not entirely sure when punk started, but that sensibility has always been there. This idea of rebellion. I think that's, especially for younger people, it always remains relevant. So he's getting on in age, and it will continue to be personal to people because of that sense of rebellion. I think it's all the way through his work. Even just generally, you know, these, as you were saying, he has to show in Paris, in Europe, and he works on these sort of very Western archetypes, and I don't want to say subverts them, but you know, he has a play around with them, whether it's like the military man, the tailoring. It is very much within that framework. He's setting up what he wants to say, and he's always pushing against it. That's why I personally have such an emotional connection to his work, because I recognize that sense of like fighting in a system where you might not necessarily feel you belong, which is what I think he was doing, especially like in the 80s. If you look at some of those early like reports on him and some of the early journalism, they weren't very nice. Like Hiroshima Chic wasn't them being kind to him. They were kind of taking the mick out of what he was doing. And so if you come into a system like that, where you are disrupting the system, you weren't necessarily made to feel welcome, you fight back, and it's still there season after season, him fighting back. And I think that's why people have such a strong connection to his work.
And Rachel, do you see that fight in his clothes?
Yeah, I mean, I think he is certainly rebellious, but even more than that, he's so anti-establishment, you know, which is like, that's the perennial appeal of Yohji, is that like whatever is the sort of, you know, going system at the moment, he's working against that. And it's not reactive at all. I mean, he's someone who's incredibly dedicated to his beliefs. But you can certainly see also that very punk element of, you know, the way that he deconstructs clothing. And that's always been for him about this, both philosophy and physical deconstruction of clothing. That is also something you see in punk, you know, I mean, like Richard Hell will talk a lot about putting safety pins in his clothes because they were actually ripped, but you know that Richard Hell was like maybe yanking out the holes a little bit more to like make them more appealing. And I think you can sort of see that sort of like tender corruption sense that Yohji also shares for sure. And I think, I mean, even last season, it's funny, certainly in the menswear world in the United States, like everyone is talking about Yohji right now. He's kind of like the obsession of the moment, which is a funny way to think about Yohji, but that's kind of the conversation here. And at the end of last season's menswear show backstage, he said that he felt like such a partisan and he didn't feel at all like he was part of the fashion system. And I was like, well, gosh, it's like not since maybe like 1999 has Yohji been such a part of the fashion system and so much in the conversation in a certain way as he is now.
But do you think that's maybe, you know, designers of his stature are working at that level as so they can like to believe that they're not part of fashion? Because quite often when people say they're not part of fashion, it's said with this kind of ego and this pride. It's like, well, I'm not into fashion. I'm not fashion. You know, I'm something else. But what is that something else? And I think maybe with someone like Yohji, even in those comments, it's probably, you know, he's almost so far removed from the reality of where his clothes may end up or be seen, just purely because of his own success. You know, the more successful you get in lots of ways, you become, I guess it's kind of swaddled from the reality of whatever it is you're doing or making or saying or thinking. And so maybe there's a sense of that. But I think so much of the way we look at and establish a narrative for Yohji's work is about this kind of poetry and this darkness and this kind of deconstruction and, you know, all of these things that some other designers kind of dip into. But it's definitely something that is maintained throughout every single one of Yohji's collections across all of the different brands that actually he has. I wondered what you thought about, Rachel, this idea. Why do you think America is now having this moment for him? Why do you think it's resonating so much with, you know, your peers who are in lots of ways shaping the tastes of American fashion fans?
Well, I think one part of it is just practically, you know, we've all idolized Rei Kawakubo for a very long time. And we've all come to this, I think we've come to, again, to reappreciate Issey Miyake. You know, it's basically like impossible to find those plissé pants. They like immediately sell out on, you know, every website here and in stores here. So, you know, we've kind of had this moment of reappreciating those two designers. And of course, their primary peer is Yohji. And he hadn't really had that renaissance yet. And so naturally, just kind of the cycle of fashion obsessions and grail cultures works in that way, not to be too cynical about it, but that is kind of how it works. But I think the other thing is that a lot of what we're talking about now in fashion, how do we consider collections not necessarily as a season to season thing, but as a kind of larger expression of a designer's vision, which is a question of sustainability as well as kind of an aesthetic concern. That is just something that Yohji has been doing forever, it's just his sensibility. So it feels really right for now. The other thing that I've really noticed is that his sense of humor seems to really resonate with the sensibility of the fashion industry at this moment. It's funny, if you look at some of his knitwear, particularly from the early 2000s, you can see that a lot of streetwear brands like Palace and Supreme and Stussy are really clearly looking at those pieces of knitwear and kind of echoing them in some of the winky kind of t-shirts and bowling shirts that they're doing. So I think it's just, it's the sensibility that is something that I think is really resonating with people right now. Like this kind of sense of humor that isn't so brash. It isn't such a Balenciaga Ventma kind of sense of humor. It's a little more clever and a little more winking and more cerebral, certainly.
Mm-hmm. Syed, what do you think about this enduring legacy? What is it about Yohji's clothes that you think, make us come back to them time and time again?
I think it's just the fact that he has this continuous thread all the way through. The emotion stays the same, or the emotional connection stays the same. So it's interesting that I can take a piece from 15 years ago and still wear it with a piece that came out today. In my own wardrobe, I've got like some pieces from 10, 15 years ago. I've got pieces from last year, and they work together so seamlessly because there is this continuation that I think not a lot of designers necessarily do. There are designers who have like a clear signature. There are designers who you can see, like Karl Lagerfeld, you can spot when he was all throughout his career, you could spot his work. You kind of knew what you were getting no matter where he went, even though he was doing different design languages depending on, the house, you would be able to recognize it. Yohji is continual in a way that I think very few designers get the freedom to be, or get the freedom to have. So the one that always comes to mind for me is like Anta Müller-Meester, in that you can see all the way through her career until she stepped back, is that it works together. There is that continuation there. And I think if you can find that in a designer, and then you're basically theirs for life. It's one of those things where it can grow with you. So year after year after year, those consumers can go back. I, as like a fan, can go back, and it will always be, of course it changes. There's a lot of like evolution there, but that it feels, well, I don't know, to me it feels like home. It's just like, it's always, the decor might change, but the overall feeling is always something that you can relate to. And I think that's what the appeal is. And then on the idea of the humor, I do love his sense of humor because it's not so self-conscious. He's quite willing to take the mick out of himself. So one of my favorite t-shirts is the Yohji. There's like a drawing of him and it says, let me eat you. And from any other designer, I would find that so corny, but with him, I love it. So
I wonder, go on.
Oh, I just wanted to say what you were saying about all of the pieces kind of working together and sort of going into that universe where everything, there is an evolution season to season, but this kind of overarching thing. I think this idea of like fashion tribes is really appealing to people right now. I mean, I think we're seeing that as well with Rick Owens. And I think he's someone who spiritually is quite well aligned with Yohji. But, this idea that you are kind of invited into this universe, and that you kind of give yourself over to this clothing and that it spiritually gives something back to you, is a unique thing that Yohji really represents. I remember when I was in Paris in January, I went to the store and there was this wonderful woman working there who was helping me try on all these different things, because it's kind of like, when you're trying on Yohji, it's like, oh my God, is this the sleeve? Is this the neck hole? So, but she told me at the end of our time together, she said, when you wear Yohji, it's really for you. You feel it. and you don't think about anyone else. And I think this idea of clothing where you're not thinking about anyone else is so interesting and exotic in this moment where clothing is so Instagram forward.
Mm. So it makes you feel like you're part, well, it actually makes you feel separated from everybody or protected, potentially, cocooned. Because I'm interested, again, is this idea that at the beginning of his career, and maybe even now, lazy journalists would call him avant-garde. I don't really see him as avant-garde, but I wanted to ask you both what you thought that means now. What does avant-garde mean in terms of design? Because of course, if we look back at his career and when, you know, I think we obviously forget that in the early 80s when Yohji was showing his clothes, particularly in Paris, what else was being shown on that schedule? You know, it was the polar opposite in every single way. It's perhaps more documented in his women's wear, and when people talk about his women's wear, because his view on the way women should dress have been recorded quite a lot. He hasn't really passed that many comments, I don't think, on how men should dress, but his opinions on women are kind of, you know, he's anti-heels, he's anti kind of traditional ideas of sexy. He's more cerebral in lots of ways in the way he expects people to wear his clothes and feel in his clothes. But I wondered what you both felt about this idea of the avant-garde and where we get that from now, because it does feel like at this juncture, the world is incredibly complicated and it's a very messy world, but one that has the potential to throw up some quite exciting opportunities, be that for creativity, be that for learning, be that for, you know, for anything. So now would feel like a great time for something avant-garde to pop up, but am I kind of hoping for too much? Do we think that's even possible, Rachel?
I mean,
big question.
This morning I was reading Kiko's comments about his own show, and he said, there are no ideas left. It's impossible to have any new ideas. Everything is boring. And I kind of wonder if that's true. I mean, I think we are kind of in a cycle right now which I think is totally okay, where we're sort of, we're building the history of fashion as it's happening, right? And that's why a lot of designers, like Yohji, but also, you know, Prada, Raf Simons are sort of looking back at their own archives and reasserting these codes that they invented. And I think that that's kind of okay for the moment. I think it's actually necessary when everything has been moving at such a fast churn. I think the idea of there being an avant-garde at the moment would be really exciting, but I'm not sure that there is really the creative space and fashion for that right now. I don't know.
Syed?
I do wonder, like, how we need to understand avant-garde. Do we think of it in terms of design? Do we think of it in terms of materials? Do we think of it in terms of just like the structure and rearranging the fashion system? Because if, like Kiko said, and I did find that I could understand where he was coming from in that, saying, you know, things are quite boring. There is a lot being done now that is being heralded as new that really isn't, because the cycle of fashion. So then I wonder if it's reliant on using new materials, new technologies, and just really pushing that forward rather than necessarily, I don't want to say, like, you know, you can't still innovate in terms of pattern cutting or anything, but I do think like the technological side of things, or even just being able to live stream shows and having these videos and changing the way that fashion is consumed, is pushing things forward. And then the more creativity people have in terms of that and putting it together, you know, having maybe like a more artistic shoot versus something that is very clear and telling you this is what the show looks like, something that's more of a vibe instead. And these different ways of approaching it, you can try and find something not necessarily new to say, but a new way to say it, which we haven't heard before, we haven't seen before. And so that's where I think, or at least that's where my understanding is, that like where the avant-garde of fashion will be. It will be in changing the way we approach the system and changing the way designers interact with it. And it will be all the way down, I hope, you know, from top to bottom, consumers changing the way they interact as well. Because yeah, things are changing, and the world now really, well, in the the past year has definitely changed quite a lot, and we have to adapt with it, and with all of the social issues going on as well, and Generation Z really waking up and wanting to change things and their approach to even just fast fashion. And I think it is like a system-wide thing where everyone has to respond in some way, shape or form, or they will be left behind.
I just think in lots of ways fashion has become this kind of dried fruit, if you like. It's been squeezed of all the juices. So what we're left with is this kind of very beautiful husk, which and again, to be kind of quite cynical about it, I mean, it's not about bashing Instagram or bashing Gen Z. It's not about any of those things. It's just a reality of where we're at right now. But fashion itself actually feels like maybe not the right space to do some of the things that I think we're asking it to do. You know, over the last couple of months, I've been really fascinated, and conversations I'm having with friends and peers is very much about, you know, we're asking fashion to answer so many of the social ills of our time, and the moral ills of our time. And I think it's not, in my personal opinion, it's not really built to do some of this stuff. And so that's where it all gets very tricky. It's where we get kind of cancel culture. That's where we get kind of designers not taking risks. That's where we may kind of not find any avant-garde clothing, to Syed's point about what are we talking about, material or whatever. But where we may get that is with the imagery or the tools that are used to communicate. And over the last couple of days, I guess we've seen some designers try different things. Obviously Virgil with this kind of idea of having a show that's physical in another market or another territory, but kind of leading us up to it with several films or animations. Hermès doing a live stream of a kind of 15-minute backstage happening of a show. But what's fascinating, again, I think with Yohji, when we say Yohji Yamamoto, most people think of the imagery that has been created by some of the kind of best known photographers, Nick Knight obviously being one of them. And I think his imagery is really, has been and is considered still relatively avant-garde, you know, kind of Susie Bick smoking. These pictures are kind of burned into our memories of actually what Yohji is about. Although, if we look at these images, they don't necessarily relate very closely to the clothes and the language and the kind of way that we imagine his collection. So maybe, Syed, you're right, is this idea of the avant-garde will hopefully come out of the way things are presented to us or told to us. I still think, and all of you should read Rachel's piece that went live on GQ this morning about digital shows and you know, what they mean and why they have in some ways kind of made things a bit better and easier. But I think there still haven't been enough risks taken. And so the kind of question I wanted to ask you both before we do go on to look at what Yohji's done is, what would you expect a designer like Yohji Yamamoto to have made in quarantine to show during Digital Paris Men's Fashion Week? If I got that title right. What do we expect? Because I think for most of them, we were like, okay, they're going to do a video. Okay, they're going to do a music video, or they're going to have GIFs, or they're going to do a, you know, an Instagram live conversation, sketching at the studio. What did we expect Yohji to do? Rachel.
I actually expected Yohji to do just a straight on live stream runway show. I think actually he's one of the rare designers for whom that very traditional white show space, like rickety, uncomfortable chairs, all of us cramped together with the really slow runway walk, that actually is like the perfect way to take in Yohji. Yeah. So I was sort of expecting that he would just produce something that was similar to that, somehow reflected or created that energy, which of course can be kind of hard to do by video, but you know, is also like the simplest way to make a video.
Yeah. Syed, what did you expect, or what did you want him to do?
Well, I was expecting exactly the same. I was expecting white room and then walking out very slowly, turning around so you can see the clothing in motion, because that is when, like, Yohji's work to me comes alive. You have to see it in motion, or you have to wear it and experience it. When I'm talking about his work, I often feel like Morpheus in the Matrix, saying, you know, I can't tell you what the Matrix is, you have to see it for yourself. Same thing with Yohji, that I can't explain it to you. You have to either see it moving for yourself or put it on and wear it for yourself, because it is so dynamic, it is so experiential. And so then I assumed that it would be just a traditional runway show. And And what I hoped is, well, I mean, to be honest, I hope the same thing, because I just like being able to see clothes really clearly. And yeah, just having a very good visual, like clear image of this is the look, this is the look, this is the look, seeing the product codes and everything, and going, okay, I'll keep an eye out for that in store, that in store, that in store. I want to try these things on.
Yeah. But I think what you've done is you've just, I guess, voiced the difficulty, or the difficult truth, that there will be lots of victims of this kind of, or there have been, of the digital age. By victim, I mean, you know, lots of the brands that have been making digital content for us for this week, and from London Men's Fashion Week that was about 2 weeks ago, seem relatively new to it. So I think there's been this kind of, you know, big sigh of breath from some of us who are like, oh, finally you figured out that you should use your website to do something. Finally, you figured out that you need to post something a little bit more interesting or engaging, or you need to have a strategy. And I think this is the thing that maybe with a brand like Yohji, we didn't really know, or I didn't really know what kind of strategy there would be, or if there was anything. And let's have a look at the film. So this film for Spring Summer 21, which, as I said in the introduction, has been made by the Japanese photographer Takai, who has recently also, it was published earlier this year, a book that focuses on Yohji's archive. There you go.
I can't get it to
model
focus.
there. No, there you go. Fluence.
Looks
The
good.
continuance of Yohji. There you go. Thank you for that demonstration. So this video here has a soundtrack in which someone can be heard singing, but also Yohji himself is speaking at certain points, and we all think playing the harmonica. The collection itself features a lot of militaria, so it looks like lots of kind of 19th century army military wear, for example, and the gold buttons have been replaced for actual buttons, or in most cases, little eyes, which are reminiscent of lots of Salvador Dali paintings. So that's quite interesting in itself. Just a snippet from the actual notes of the collection: soldier uniforms for a Yohji army fighting the current world in crises. Global warming, social movements, sanitary emergencies, animal protection. Yohji Yamamoto expresses his feelings in his own poetic way. Eyes printed on clothes as witnesses of what is happening today in our world, and also looking into the future. So quite a literal explanation and interpretation of this idea of thinking and looking, going to the actual eye itself. But what did you both think of the collection and the presentation that we're watching here now? We can't play you the music due to copyright laws, but you can go onto Yohji's website to obviously watch the video for yourself, which I think actually does add another layer to the presentation. It does help understand maybe what you're looking at a little bit more. But Rachel, what did you think of the collection?
I loved it. I thought it was wonderful. I mean, I loved the little, I mean, with Yohji, it's always fun to look at both the silhouette and those tiny details. And so the details of the little eyes were so interesting. And this idea, I mean, he very frequently talks about looking to the past, looking to the future. And so this idea of both witnessing, history, but also serving as a steward of history is very important to him. And so I love to see that sort of reflected in the garments themselves. And I thought the military ideas were really interesting. Of course, it's like Yohji is the kind of thing where you can start collecting at any time, and it very much is something that you collect. And I think that this collection in particular lent itself well to this. And of course there are great tailored pieces. There's this amazing sort of double-breasted jacket that I really liked quite a lot. So I thought it was wonderful.
And some of the pieces were worn unbuttoned as well. So some of the sleeves looked like they could come away. So they were kind of left slightly open. And again, to Syed's point about seeing the clothes in motion, it was very much, you were able to do that here, although it wasn't exactly clear. The moody kind of lighting maybe didn't give us as much information as maybe we needed. I suspect that this has also been made for the sales team, because occasionally what happens is the garment descriptions with the fabric compositions come up, which I think is an interesting idea in this digital kind of experience. And we've seen obviously Jonathan Anderson of his own label and of Loewe really embracing this idea of the tactility and sending out fabric samples along with other experiential things, phygital experiences, which is Rachel's favorite word. I think she changed her name legally. Digital experiences, which I can't believe I said it again because it's such a disgusting word. But there's been this kind of idea of actually, what does this feel like? What is this? And with a designer like Yohji, obviously we have those questions, because it does feel like the texture and the handle of the fabric is so much at the core of his message. Syed, what did you make of it all?
I absolutely loved it. As soon as you say Yohji Army, I'm in. Like back in the day, in the forum days, there was a really quite a large like Yohji menswear thread, and like everyone who was everyone in those days was on it, and like that. I considered us the Yohji Army. David Lee, rest in peace, like Kiko before he was a designer, Yegwa, like a ton of us. And everyone used to compile information, and like on your thing about the codes, I have one of his like tags here where it breaks it down. So like the H is in for the men, then the second letter, it goes in like a running alphabet season to season. So you can normally date and figure out which season it is depending on the letter. Then it'll have like whether it's a jacket, trousers, whatever, followed by the number, then the fabric code, which I was happy to see was there, because if you've got any of his old work, you can feel what the fabric is by feeling stuff. So like as soon as you see the 100, you know, like the Yohji boys are coming out in full force, because it's the gabardine wool, and everyone, that's like the grail, that's the material everyone wants their Yohji in. So that made me really happy to see these fabric codes, because it's if you've experienced Yohji before, and you kind of know which ones your favorite fabrics are, and you can pick those out. In general, the collection, I think it was one of his strongest in a long while, which I wasn't expecting, because I thought, okay, pandemic, maybe he's not like feeling fully up to it, and maybe next season we'll get something amazing. This for me was just the perfect mood, especially if we're all coming out of lockdown, feeling a bit battered, a bit worn, seeing these like frayed edges, seeing the buttons undone where it's like, oh, the sleeve has been torn, no it isn't, seeing like the messages on there. I think one of them says like the earth has become too hot or too warm. I think I wrote it down somewhere. Look 17, the earth has become too hot. Just these messages there. And even Yohji at the end, when the back of his blazer where it says fragile and the threads coming down. I sometimes wonder, like people do talk of it as being like dark or melancholic, but to me that vulnerability is sort of optimistic and empowering, because it's no matter what happens, I will continue going forward. And this is something in a lot of his shows where you see like bruised models, especially in the men's show, or they've got cuts on them and they're always fighting through. And it's like this determination that I won't stop. And then you have the little jokes, you have the little like references. There's in this collection, there's one of the tops with Yohji and his dog. There's one of like the woman holding the scissors to him. I love all the like little personal motifs that you see running through the collections. It's like, oh, there's that. We recognize all of these little pieces, and it's like one for the fans, but also for other people to see these. Yeah, it doesn't matter how dark it necessarily is, there's always like a light connected to it. And I love that. I love that. To me anyway, it always feels optimistic. Some seasons maybe not so much, you know, when he's got not for sale written on his back or whatever, it's quite funny. There is like an emotion there. Like wearing Yohji for me is always about optimism and just feeling comfortable in yourself, feeling comfortable in society.
Back to your point about the online community that used to exist, I guess, which probably now exists in a different way, but maybe not for you or for your generation, if you like. What was it that brought you all together to kind of fanboy on Yohji, do you think?
I think it's just, for me, Yohji is about philosophy. There is for the menswear is this idea of the vagabond, like one man standing against the world. You are always, if you don't quite fit in anywhere, you fit in with Yohji. It's open arms. Anyone, it doesn't matter what size you are, it doesn't matter where you're from, it doesn't matter anything. Like, okay, fine, yes, there is a financial barrier. It's very expensive. For me, especially like as a student, I scrimped and saved and bought things secondhand and got things from Japan because I couldn't afford anything like retail. It is just this philosophy and the idea that as you are is okay. So one word that gets, or one phrase that gets thrown around a lot with Yohji's work is one size fits all. And most of it isn't actually one size fits all. It's just a lot of stores will stock a size 3. And a size 3, most people can wear. So it doesn't really matter what waist size you are. You either belt it up or you can wear it without, although most people wouldn't be able to wear it without a belt because some of these are like huge trousers. But for me, especially, and for some of the other ones, it was just this camaraderie in that here is something that we recognize, this idea of rebellion, of not quite fitting in. And I do think you see it with the younger generation now as well. So on Twitter, for example, you've got like the 18 to 24-year-old bracket who are very active in terms of fashion. So like high fashion Twitter. There are like little subgroups, anti-fashion Twitter, avant-garde, and archive fashion Twitter, and all of these little groups. I will group them together. I apologize to them for calling them more high fashion Twitter, but you see the people, and it's still there. You've got, in their usernames now, so many people reference Yohji, Yohji distortion, anti-Yohji, naughty Yohji, all of these words with Yohji in them. That makes me so happy because I'm like, oh, look, the torch has been passed on. More people are joining. This is amazing.
The army has grown.
Yes. Yes.
Rachel, and you're part of the
Nicki Minaj.
I'm not sure I want to go head to head with the Barbs, but we can try.
That would be no, don't, please. That's scary. I think another thing that I was interested in, to quote Yohji again from his book My Dear Bomb, which was published in 2010, after a kind of difficult period for him in the business, where he, made someone within his company made some quite difficult or bad decisions, and he ended up going bankrupt, or the company went bankrupt. And he said this: "To be modern is to tear the soul out of everything," which I thought was quite an amazing, wonderful caption in many ways. But to be modern is to tear the soul out of everything. I guess this is in response to this idea of being asked about modernity and people thinking about the current season being the thing that we should all be looking at. And as Rachel mentioned as well, we have Raf Simons reproducing his archive pieces like for like. You have lots of designers now understanding the, I guess, power of the past and things that they have made before, but also in some cases it's, a commercial decision. Raf Simons' decision to remake those things probably has an awful lot to do with high fashion Twitter, as Syed has just mentioned. So I wondered what you thought about this idea of modernity and Yohji, and are those things, because people have called his work timeless before, but even the word timeless, I think, has a relative time frame to it, I think, when we use it. So I wondered, Rachel, do you think it's modern, what he's doing?
It's a complicated question because I've been thinking a lot recently about how I just want to dress like a 90s fashion editor, like I just want to wear Ann Demeulemeester and Yohji and like that's, that whole look. So the fact that, I guess the reason why I mentioned that is the fact that in my mind, I can say, oh, this is very, 90s to me, works against the idea of this being modern. And also, the thing is, like, when you're thinking about a Yohji show, you're not thinking about a new silhouette, which is what we typically think about when we think about designers who are obsessed with modernity. So someone like Raf Simons, or of course Miuccia Prada, who really shift their silhouettes in like new directions every season. That's not necessarily what Yohji is interested in. So I don't know. I don't even know if I can answer the question of whether or not he's modern. It's something that, you know, I think about a lot, but I don't know, it's complicated to answer. But I mean, the other thing that's interesting about that quote is like, he wasn't saying, I mean, I'd have to reread it in context, but my memory is like, he doesn't necessarily say, and I'm therefore modern, right? Isn't he just sort of like proposing that this is his definition of modernity? I think he's someone who works with history so much, and with these kinds of, you know, archetypes of, even in this collection, for example, the military sort of shapes, which are shapes that he's used since, you know, basically the beginning of his career, which of course is a very kind of 19th century silhouette and idea. But this, at the same time, you know, I don't look at it necessarily and say, oh, this is like, reminds me of, you know, the early 80s or something. I mean, I think in my mind, like culturally, I think of the prime of Yohji as being the 90s, when like everyone at every fashion magazine was obsessed with Yohji, and Carolyn Bessette Kennedy had a whole wardrobe of Yohji. But at the same time, it doesn't look, I don't know, I would say in a certain way it does look, it looks forever cool, I should say. I don't know that it looks timeless necessarily, but it looks cool forever.
Yeah. Syed, do you agree?
I wonder what, in terms of fashion, what the word timeless means, because one of the experiences I always come back to in terms of like time and fashion, I remember I was a student and I was in the V&A museum, and there was a Helmut Lang piece behind the glass, and I was wearing a top from the same collection as was behind the glass. And I thought to myself, well, if I'm wearing this now, how is it also in a museum? Like there, it's being crystallized and it's forever untouched. And these pieces are still being worn today and will continue to be worn. So what does it mean in terms of fashion? And can we ever capture fashion as a moment of time? Because it's constantly moving forward. I don't know if it is moving forward or if it's just constantly present, because the idea of time in fashion, we think of a cycle, but then I think, well, the only moment that exists in fashion is now, or rather the moment to come, because you're designing for what's going to be. And the whole of the past is open to us. I can pick from any place in history and put it together and say, this is what's happening right now, or what's going to happen next. And then the minute it's out there, it's being consumed, then it's over. Let's move on to the next thing. There is a book that's been published. Caroline Evans edited it, Time in Fashion, or Fashion and Time, Bloomsbury. I really want to read it because it's going to be like lots of people talking about the relationship between time and fashion. I'm fascinated by this. With Yohji as well, just this idea of, you know, with one eye to the past, I walk backwards into the future. He's constantly looking back and drawing from the past to take us where we want to go, or to take us where he wants to take us. And I do like this idea that, you know, you have to learn from the past and contextualize things to know where you want to go, where we've come from, how we're going to move forward. Yeah. And so in terms of modernity, like modernity to me is this idea of just radical doubt, where there is no fixed truth, there is no fixed idea, everything is in question where modernity is concerned. And so Yohji is proposing these ideas by taking elements of the past and saying, well, this is one possibility if you want to take it. He's not forcing it on you. It's the idea that this is an option. And I love the idea of just playing around with what it means to be modern and what could be. Yeah, just obliterating time, essentially. Yeah.
Great. I wanted to end on a quote, actually, that's in the 2016 documentary Dressmaker, which you should all watch if you haven't. One of the designers that works with Yohji said, "The clothing we are making will live longer than us, so everybody will appreciate what Yohji Yamamoto is about." And I think that's really echoed in both of your accounts, I guess, of the actual clothing itself. It's really interesting that both of you mentioned experiences of trying on or wearing or negotiating the actual piece of clothing, which is of course something in our digital age we kind of forget to do. So thank you both so much for joining us. And thank you for watching. For more extensive Fashion Week coverage, you can obviously head over to SHOWstudio.com. And if you're watching via our YouTube channel, please do subscribe and comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks again, everybody.